Okay, so now we're looking at question number 4. And question number 4 says a Brooklyn apartment has been renting for $1,400 per month. In the new lease, the monthly rent increases 10% for the first year and another 5% in the second year. How much is the monthly rent after 2 years? Okay, so a nice approach, I think, since this is 1,400, we could do the benchmark method, but you could probably also do the out of every 100 method too. How many hundreds would be here? Okay, that's up to you how you want to do it. Okay, so if we're looking at the benchmark method, the starting amount here would be 1,400. Okay, and they want us to find a rent increase of 10%. Okay, so let's try to find that first. How do we think of 10%? Do you remember what we said from the previous video and from phase 1? Remember, we said to find 10%, we remove last zero from the starting amount, and the starting amount here is 1,400. So if we remove the last zero from the starting amount, that would be how much? Removing that zero would leave 140. Okay, so this is 10% of 1,400. So we found the 10%. What did this, according to the question, what did this 10% represent? It says in the new lease, the monthly rent increases 10%. So this 10% that we found is the monthly rent increase. Okay, so let's label that just to help us. Okay, so this is the 10% rent increase. Okay, now did this increase actually take place? Let's read the question. So in the new lease, the monthly rent increases 10% for the first year and another 5% in the second year. So in the first year it increased 10%, so it did happen. So 10% rent increase in first year. Okay, so how do we show that rent increase took place in the first year? We have to add it, right? If we add it to the previous rent, then that will demonstrate an actual increase. Okay, and what would that amount be? 0 plus 0, then 0 plus 4, and then 4 plus 1. Okay, so what is this new amount now that we just achieved? What does this represent? So this was the rent. This is how much it increased. So what is this? This must be the new rent. When? Since this happened in the first year, this must be the new rent after the first year. Okay? So, or within the first year. Let me write that instead of writing after the first year. This must be the new rent within or during the first year. Right? Okay. So for the first year, we now have the new rent. Then the question says, and another 5% in the second year. So we need to figure out how much is that 5% increase worth. and that whatever that amount is, that would be the increase that happened during the second year. So let's find that amount. Okay, so if we need to find that amount, where do we find the 5% of? Do we find 5% of what the rent used to be, or of what the rent is now? Right? When your landlord gives you a new lease, or when you rent anything, right? The landlord or the owner doesn't lease it for an old price. It leases it based on the current price, which is this. So that means we could say now, to find our 5%, our starting amount is in the current first year, right? So we're within the first year, we're finishing up the first year. So this is the new rent. Okay, so in the second year, we start this new increase of 5%. How do we think of 5%? So we could think of 5% as half of 10%. Remember that? So if we're thinking of 5% as half of 10%, then that means we need to find 10%. So I need to add that to my table. Once I find this 10%, that'll help me get to the 5%. So this is a benchmark for that amount, for that percent. How do we find 10%? Again, remove the last zero from, so this is the starting amount. So that means our 10% would be 154. Okay, but we already did that for this one. Now we're trying to find 5%, so we're just using this. This is not a part of the question. We really want 5%, so 5% we think of as half of this. So what is half of 154? So if I don't know how to find that right away, I could think of 154 as 100 plus 50 plus 4, right? $150, $150 plus 4 is 154. So to find half of that means I can find half of each of these and add them up, right? So what would that be? Half of 100 is 50. Half of 50 is 25, and half of 4 is 2, right? So in total, half of this would be 77. So 77 is actually half of 154. How do you check that? Remember what half means. So if I add 77 with itself, I should get back 154. I'll let you check that on your own. Okay, so I only need one of those halves. So this was just to check. Okay, so this is a strategy you could use when you don't know how to find right away half of a number. You could break that number into numbers you do know how to find half of, and then find half of each of those parts. Okay, so half of 154 is 77. And what is this? So now we found the 5%. What did this 5% represent according to the question? Well, that was the other increase in the second year. So we could write that. So this 77 is the 5% rent increase in second in the second year. Okay, so did that increase actually take place? Let's refer to the question. How much is the monthly rent after the 2 years? So that means the second year now went by, because they said after the 2 years, the second year now went by, so that increase actually happened. So let's show that it happened. So we could show that it happened by adding 77 to the previous rent from the first year. So what would that be? That would be 7 plus 11 plus 5 and 1 is 6. So what is this amount now? So this was the rent in the first year after that first increase. This was the increase in rent during the second year. So this must be what? Our new rent after the 2 years. Okay? So when doing these questions, it's really nice to label what the numbers represent. Every time you get a new number, label what the meaning of that number is to help you keep track, because there's a lot of numbers here. Every time you achieve a new number, label the meaning of that number so that you can understand the purpose of it, and it can help you figure out the meaning of the other numbers. Okay? So that's it for question number 4. I'll come back with question number 5.